That's enough of me. Turn the mic over to your volunteer docent from the Chicago Art Literature Center, Doug.
Hey, and it's working. Hello. Welcome, everyone. And you could hardly have picked a better day to take this cruise. We wish we had weather like this every day, but we do not. So you're in luck today. And thank you, Captain, for the introduction. And I think you're all going to have a marvelous time this afternoon because there's really no other place in the country where you can take a boat ride like this right through the heart of the city and be surrounded on both sides by these canyons of amazing buildings that I'm going to try to tell you about. We're going to be doing a little bit of time travel on this trip. We glass called ply glass, so there are actually 4 layers of glass that are laminated together to create those exterior walls. And as you can see from here, at least these days, they're a firm that's really in love with curves, so curved corners on the rooftop. Beaux-Arts style, sometimes called the American version of the French version of the Romans version of Greek architecture. Many of the design inspirations go all the way back to the ancient Greek classical world, including, of course, that temple on the roof, monumental entranceway at the street level. And the Beaux-Arts style, we'll see a few more examples of that. Really popular for our purposes through the late 1800s into the early 1920s. So now we can see the monumental entranceway to the building, a Roman arch over the doorway, some more Greek Corinthian columns flanking the doorway, and carved griffins or winged lions up above the 3rd or 4th floor there. Very decorative style. This building is covered with a gray limestone that we get from Indiana next door, some quarries outside of Bloomington, Indiana. And when it was converted to a hotel, there was some vacant land next to this property, so Getch Partners, who renovated and restored the building, also added this contemporary glass-walled addition with these kind of sawtooth and white umbrellas, and that opens up to a small plaza with a low bubbling fountain there. That's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza along the Chicago Riverwalk. And this section of the Riverwalk through the downtown portion of the city was constructed between 2014 and 2016, designed by a local architect named Carol Ross Barney. The most challenging task in creating a pedestrian walkway down here was navigating around these bridges. So these passageways underneath all of the bridges downtown are actually built out over the bed of the river, not along the river bank, because the foundations for these bridges, they're so enormous, there was no way to tunnel through them on the river bank. Every 1 block segment of the Riverwalk downtown has a different design theme. This block we're going by now is designed as a place where power boats could tie up. Another one's designed for kayak. 77 West Wacker from 1992. Temple on the rooftop, very familiar to us from the Parthenon as well as other Greek and Roman temples from the ancient world. So this is an example of a postmodern architect trying to blend together the classic traditions of architecture in a contemporary glass-walled office building. Just past this next bridge over on our left, another gray limestone covered building. This one looks a bit like a giant chair or a throne, giant armchair or a throne. This is the LaSalle Wacker building from 1930, designed by Halliburd and Root. An example of the Art Deco style, really popular in the 1920s and the 1930s especially. And these Art Deco buildings often have these setbacks and cavities and these kind of unusual geometric blocky forms that you see because city leaders in Chicago and New York City in particular developed complicated zoning codes. As buildings kept getting taller and taller, they were afraid if every tower was built out to the property line, light and air could not get down to the sidewalks to where pedestrians navigated through the city. So zoning codes were developed to minimize the extent to which towers could create pedestrian canyons on the streets. And ahead of us on the left, it's about a block ahead of us, there's another tall postmodern building. It has two towers facing the river. It looks like they're kind of flying saucers landing on the rooftop with these straight spiked antennas sticking out of them. And this is the 225 West Wacker building from 1989, designed by K. Visit Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio in Oak Park, Illinois today. And right next to that building on the left, we see this green glass-walled building with this beautiful curve kind of sweeping along the roadway and the riverbank. This is the 333 West Wacker building from 1983, also designed by KPF. One of the first really gorgeous buildings that was built along the riverbank. All of the contextual details come from its triangular site here, so this curved wall reflects a bend in the river that we're navigating through. The color of the glass, this green and blue colors, are taken from the river, as well as the turn here over on our left. You see a building with a bright red sculpture in front of it. This is the River Point building by Picard Chilton, built here in 2017. Has a very sculptural shape, curve facing all three branches of the river. This huge urban scaled gateway arch. There are almost no windows facing the river. Most of these windows were added later. The building kind of turned its back on the river when it was constructed here, because in the late 70s the river was still considered an unsightly, polluted, smelly eyesore. But over the ensuing decades, with the help from the Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, as well as the activities of local advocates to try to clean up the river condition gradually improved. City Council in Chicago passed an ordinance in 1999 to start to regulate riverfront development downtown. One of the provisions they added was a requirement that new developments had to add a 30-foot or a 10-meter wide setback right along the riverfront, and we see an example of that over on our left. This is the Kinsey Park development from 2002. So here we have brick townhomes and this company. Up above the first floor here, you see these relief sculptures, kind of a dragonfly with some stylized riverfront plants surrounding them. This is an example of the Art Deco graphic design style. Art Deco style streamlined, simplified, and abstracted forms into more geometric like designs. So the buildings are have much less naturalistic detail, and the graphic design is much more stylized and less naturalistic as well. The main building of the Montgomery Ward campus is just to our right now. This was the warehouse and distribution center built here in 1906 to 1908, designed by Schmidt, Garden, and Martin. And you see these bands of brick that go all the way from one end of the building to the other without any break in them, emphasizing kind of the long horizontal character of this building. This was an idea borrowed from one of their contemporaries and colleagues, Frank Lloyd Wright, who used horizontal lines very prominently in his prairie-style houses to reflect the flat landscapes that we have here in the Midwest. And up on the third floor there, you see these kind of torch-like elements designed also in a very simplified, geometric, stylized way that is also right out of the Frank Lloyd Wright design playbook. And here, because these buildings were built right out to the edge of the river, no room to put a open river walk along the riverfront, but when this building was recently converted into a general office building, they carved out a river walk, a covered river walk, on the first floor along the waterfront. And this is as far as we're going to go on the North Branch. We're going to make a turn here. And the one legacy in the pop culture world that the Montgomery Ward Company has left us is the character of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. He was created and conceived by a copywriter in the Montgomery Ward advertising department in the late 90s. Thick White Corners was the very last building built by the Montgomery Ward Company. That was their headquarters in 1974. The architect was Minoru Yamasaki from Seattle. And very unusual to cover up the corners or wrap the corners of a tall building. Most developers want to maximize the number of corner windows you have in a building. But in this case, the executives of the Ward Company They wanted to have a very egalitarian and non-hierarchical workplace. They didn't want their employees fighting over who had the better corner office or who had the better view. So they just told the architect to cover up all the corner windows in that building, and that's exactly what he did. That too is another adaptive reuse project, no longer an office building. It's been converted to residential condominiums as well. And that statue, we'll get a peek of it here on the rooftop of the 1930 building, was a symbol of the company. Commerce lighting the way to progress was the name of it. It's a Roman goddess, Diana, holding a torch and carrying a symbol of commerce with her. Over on our right, we see the Chicago Tribune logo and some red brick buildings here. For those of you who are Chicagoans, this apparently is all going to be demolished and torn down. This is where our first Chicago Las Vegas style hotel, casino, entertainment complex is going to be built. So in 3 or 4 years, all of this will be gone and we'll have a giant hotel and a casino here apparently. Today it's still the home of the Chicago Tribune printing plant, distribution center, and they've actually moved their headquarters and staff offices over here as well. Tribune Company is actually celebrating 175 years in business this month. They published their first issue in June of 1847. And we've been on the river for a while now, and if you've been in Chicago for any length of time, you can gaze upon this river and easily conclude it's not what you would call a wild river. We don't have any white water on the Chicago River. There's almost no current to speak of. One visitor from the 19th century said that the river was, the water in the river moved so slowly that it was quote unquote too lazy to clean itself. But the most interesting fact about our river, of course, is that over the course of its lifetime, it's actually flowed in 2 completely opposite directions. It has drained into Lake Michigan and it has drained away from Lake Michigan. And the story of how the flow of the river was reversed is still regarded as one of the great civil engineering projects of the 19th century. So I'll just tell you a little bit of Lake Michigan over here. So the natural flow of the river is to go into Lake Michigan. And that was fine for thousands of years until this community of Chicago began to be constructed on the banks of the river. In 1830, there were only 100 people living here in what became the Chicago area. 60 years later, there were over 1 million people living here, and over the course, so by 1890, over 1 million people. And as the city idea of this water engineer in the 1880s was to dig a canal that would connect the south branch of the Chicago rivers, dig the canal deep enough so that it was more than twice as deep as the Chicago River, and would gravity would naturally take all of the water from the river and start to steer it in that direction. And that is really what came about. It took about 10 years throughout the 1880s for all of the politics to be worked out and for approval of this project to go through. It took 10 years in the 1890s to actually build it. It's the largest earth-moving project in North America at the time that it occurred. And in January of 1900, they dynamited the last of the dams, and for the first time, all of the water in the Chicago. It's a French word that means rocker or seesaw, and so that principle is used on all of our mechanical bridges here. And directly ahead of active railroad tracks beneath this building as well, so they had to wedge the foundation in between the rail lines, and they also had to put this 30-foot walkway or 10-meter wide river walk facing the water. So this was the solution. That's architecture critics called this building a ground scraper rather than a skyscraper, because all of the visual razzle-dazzle in this building is happening right here along the riverfront. And all of that was done just to create an open, spacious pedestrian river walk along the many Art Deco buildings have. It's much wider than that chair we saw earlier, so some people think it resembles more of a love seat than a chair or a throne. But this is today the home of the Lyric Opera of Chicago, as well as the Joffrey Ballet Dance Company. And those tall limestone covered buildings, those kind of massive blocky buildings in the Art Deco style was really the building art in the 1930s and the 1940s. If you're a American film noir aficionado, you see a lot of them in those film noir movies. It wasn't until after World War II that modernism really became popular in the United States. And over on our right, we see some examples of the modernist style that emerged after World War II. I think if you try to look at them with a historical context in mind, they may look a little more radical from a historical perspective than they do today, when we can see thousands of them all over the world. But these were all designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill along the right side of the river. The classic, these are 1960s buildings with the classic modernist features, very rigid rectangular geometries. Glass and steel are the main materials. You can see the materials right on the exterior of the building. They did tint the windows green to contextually reference the river here. And of course you can see rail cars and rail activity beneath these buildings, so they're also built on stilts up above railroad tracks. The man who really popularized this style in North America, as I mentioned before, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, born in Germany. The 20th century was really the age of steel in terms of the structural material for tall and super tall buildings. But in the 21st century, concrete advancements in the technology and the strength of concrete has made it the material of choice for all tall and super tall buildings. So as we go by this one, you'll be able to see some concrete columns and some concrete floor plates, and they're now starting to cover it up with the glass skin or the glass membrane on top of all that concrete. But concrete, of course, not a new material, and just past this construction site we see a vintage concrete building from 1986. This is River City, designed by Bertrand Goldberg. Bertrand Goldberg was a modernist architect, but he didn't subscribe to the glass and steel rectangular box style of modernism. He claimed that there were no right angles in nature, so he gravitated toward concrete and these kind of curved sculptural, softer forms. This was a live, work, play environment in concept, so there's a marina for boats here. The lower 3 floors have spaces for retail shops, as well as commercial office space, medical offices, optometrists, pharmacies, all of that kind of stuff. And up above that, there are family-sized apartment units with these very distinctive eyebrow-shaped windows. We'll see another example of Goldberg's work a little bit later on. When this project was built here in 1986, though, it was really isolated from the built-up part of downtown. So it was important to have groceries, pharmacies, hairdressers, all of those services on site. So he built this as a project to kind of a light show. I think they have them at 8:30 and 9 o'clock this evening. So if you happen to be in this area after dark and you see lights flashing on the side of that building. Spiral parking platters for automobiles. This is the first glimpse we get of Marina City. This was also designed by Bertrand Goldberg, who did the River City project. We have these semicircular balconies on all the apartment units here. So this was another city within a city idea. That gray kind of saddle-shaped building behind the apartment tower was originally a movie theater, and today it's the House of Blues nightclub. There's a marina for boats at the base of this building as well. 2 identical apartment towers. In between the apartment towers at the back, there was originally designed as an office building, but today it's been converted into a hotel. In addition to a movie theater, there was a bowling alley, a skating rink, another live, work, play idea of Goldberg's, financed by one of the labor unions in Chicago. Project through, but we have 26 miles of publicly owned lakefront land in Chicago, and this was kind of regarded as a mistake when it got built here. So there won't be any more private development on this side of Lakeshore Drive. In the distance beyond, you see the Ferris wheel and the mid-rise buildings. It is our newest mid-rise buildings on the left here, our newest residential neighborhood. It's called Lakeshore East. There's about 12 or 15 buildings that surround a public park here, and around 10,000 residents live here. Didn't really exist 20 years ago. Actually, 150 years ago, that would have been the surface of Lake Michigan. That's all built on landfill. 100 years ago, it would have been rail yards, and 50 years ago, it would have been. We do see the St. Regis Chicago from here, the most prominent building in this whole development. And you can see the three stems are offset slightly from one another. A 60-story office building along the river here. They had the same challenge of building a tall tower on a relatively small piece of land. They also had to put that river walk along the waterfront. Normally these river walks are supposed to be open to the sky, but the developers negotiated with city planners, and the solution they came up with was this 60-foot high, or about a 17-meter high overhang above the river walk. And then instead of putting a row of structural columns along the riverfront here, they pinched 3 of the columns together into these totally awesome trident-shaped columns.